done. Okay, let me make sure that everything is streaming properly. I'll just leave that up. I'll leave that. Make sure it's running. Got an email. Don't do that. Cool. And then, of course, when I go back to this, it's going to go down. Yep. Right. Based on the video, I believe this is where we ended last time. Again, it's weird to have two classes at two different times in the same material. But based on everything, I believe this is where we ended. So we talked about how things were not going well for the Continental Forces. But eventually, Washington and his troops discovered that the Hessians, the German mercenaries, were stationed right across the Delaware River from where Washington was, and they made their way across, which, as I said, was very dangerous. Lots of ice, big and heavy enough to break apart these little boats. But they made it across, shot a bunch of drunk Germans who were just trying to have a good Christmas Eve, and eventually pushed into Princeton, New Jersey, engaged the British there, and managed to push them out of New Jersey entirely, after which they settled back in New York, which, again, they will remain there until the end of the war. This also allowed Continental Congress to return to Philadelphia because after, as we saw in the previous slide, when the British had pushed into New Jersey, they got too close to Philadelphia for the Congress's comfort, so they fled to Baltimore, which, I mean, isn't that far off, but, I mean, I guess when your fastest troops are on horseback, and that's not really, most of your troops are on foot. You don't have to worry too much about, like, a blitzkrieg. So, the following year, the British decided to step things up a bit. General Howe changed his tactics and decided that he wanted to more quickly force the colonists to surrender. He had gotten tired of playing nice, essentially, rather than just slap the army around and get them to surrender that way. He was going to go in and capture Philadelphia and force a political surrender. Washington forces could only really engage in delaying tactics. There was no way Washington could engage Howe's army in a pitched battle without being completely crushed. It was not at all an equal situation between the militaries. General John Burgoyne moved north to capture Fort Ticonderoga, which he did July 7th. General Howe was supposed to head up as well to act as reinforcement. However, Howe was already on his way to Philadelphia, which is to the south, because, again, Fort Ticonderoga is up in, I believe, New York State. Do I have a map here? I do. Ticonderoga is like on the line between New York State and Vermont. Well, modern day Vermont. Vermont wasn't really a thing yet. Yeah, so Howe was already too far south and just continued to make his way to Philadelphia, which he did capture in September. General Barry St. Ledger, who was also supposed to head up to help Burgoyne, was making his way across New York State. while Joseph Brant and his sister Molly, who were both Mohawk leaders, if you recall from previous slides, were also gathering native forces to help the British. So Burgoyne's up in Fort Ticonderoga basically by himself with his army, but he's supposed to have 2 more armies supporting him, but they're off doing their own thing. So the Americans took advantage of this. German-American farmers led by General Nicholas Herkimer held off the British and allowed General Benedict Arnold to get to Fort Stanwix with reinforcements to push the British back to Canada. So they managed to deflect a group of British who were trying to get up to aid Burgoyne. I've already lost the guy's name. What was most important was the Battle of Saratoga. So this was Burgoyne on his own, again, supposed to have been reinforced by 2 more armies of British troops, but was essentially left by himself against the Green Mountain Boys, Horatio Gates, and Benedict Arnold, as well as Oneida allies. Now, while Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold were basically the same rank, Benedict Arnold was the senior officer there and led this particular battle. So the forces of Burgoyne were crushed at Freeman's Farm, doubled the casualties of the Continentals, and while how taking Philadelphia was a major blow to Continental morale, the fact that these scruffy patriots managed to absolutely decimate a British army at the Battle of Saratoga, not just like, oh, well, we have more troops, so we beat the crap out of them. They also managed to use tactics and keep reinforcements from getting to Burgoyne before essentially surrounding the poor guy on 3 sides, before beating the tar out of him. So this was a big deal. The Battle of Saratoga was a major turning point in the war. Hint, hint, that's probably important. And Benedict Arnold was technically the guy leading this battle. Again, Horatio Gates was another important general. We'll see him later when it comes to the war in the South. But technically, Benedict Arnold was the leading officer here. I have some of the maps here. Howe actually went around by sea to hit Philadelphia from the south. Clinton, another British general, was supposed to reinforce as well, but got stopped before Albany. St. Ledger was pushed back into Canada, and that left Burgoyne by himself. Here's a better map of the actual battles. Yeah, see, there's Oriskany, where St. Ledger was stopped and pushed back into Canada. Gates was stopped here before Stillwater, and then, or no, that's Gates is our guy. Gates and Arnold went north to hit Burgoyne at Saratoga. And again, it wasn't that Saratoga was some major strategic victory. It's not. Saratoga was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's the actual battle took place at a farm. Where's my mouse? There we go. You know, it was at Freeman's Farm. It was called Saratoga because it was near a place called Saratoga, but it was actually at a farm. but the fact that a major British general was defeated uh, was a pretty big deal. Also, um, bad jobs in the British Army. Do you want to beat a drum and be a target without a weapon? Do you want to carry a flag and be a target without a weapon? Or do you want to be shouting orders and have a sword but not really have any kind of weapon while bullets are flying at you? So, yeah, a lot of bad jobs to have in the Army. Me personally, I'd rather be on the back end of this cannon. Just never really see the enemy. Alright. I keep smacking this mic. I don't know how bad that sounds on the video. Alright. So, Washington and his troops were stationed at Valley Forge in eastern Pennsylvania. Um, and while there were some important victories at this time, as we saw, New Jersey and now Saratoga, victories don't help you stay warm or put food in your belly. So the troops were not doing well. Discipline was falling, but we did have volunteers from Europe coming over to help out. That, again, enemy of my enemy is my friend, essentially. There were folks in Europe that were like, hey, there's these people in North America giving the British a hard time, and we don't really like the British, so let's go help out. So we had, and you don't need to know all these people, but I just wanted to include them. The Prussian Baron Frederick von Steuben, even though the Prussians had allied with the British, during the 7 Years' War, but I mean, whatever. The Prussians were always up for fighting whoever. Who was specifically recruited by Benjamin Franklin. French General Marquis de Lafayette, obviously the French. Now, Marquis de Lafayette was, I would argue, about as important as General Washington when it came to getting the war done. He was a major player in securing victory for the United States in this war. Bavarian Johann Baron de Kalb and the Polish gentlemen Thaddeus Kusko and Casimir Count Pulaski. They all aided in recruitment, discipline, wages, and supplies, because most of them were, if you could tell from the names, usually pretty well off. Barons and counts and etc. They were usually pretty rich and had some backing themselves. So they were coming over and helping out with supplies and training and whatnot, because the nobility in Europe were by necessity trained in warfare. Meanwhile, on the home front, women were often forced out of their homes. If there were loyalists in an area and the Patriots took the region, they of course had to get out, or vice versa. If the British took an area that the Patriots were living in, they had to get out. A lot of times women that were following with the troops, of course, were dealing with the same lack of supplies as the men, because it's not like they were given anything extra. Some women served as spies or couriers because, it's the 1700s, and who's going to expect a woman to actually be like a spy or working with the army in any capacity? And And now we're going to look at some individuals which, I don't know if I mentioned the default topic for the next paper in this class yet. It's basically an interesting individual in the Revolutionary War. If you're going to talk about like a general or something, I don't want to hear their whole biography. I don't need a biography on George Washington, for example. But we do have some interesting, less well-known individuals that you could expand on a little bit, but center the paper around what they did during the war. For example, we had Lydia Dara, eavesdrop on British officials who occupied her house, because again, it's like, oh, it's just some lady living alone. We'll just come in and eat her food and make her cook for us. And we're going to openly talk about how we're going to capture George Washington. This lady won't be able to do anything. And she's like, you know, I know some people who know George Washington. I'm going to go out and talk to them and manage to get said info to Washington. Nancy Hart Morgan, who took it a step further, she invited some British soldiers into dinner while they were eating and drinking, probably more specifically drinking. She hid their guns, shot 2 of them, then had her neighbors come to hang the rest. Yeah, Nancy Hart Morgan didn't play. Margaret Corbin, she's one of the Molly Pitcher types, which is to say women who would bring water from like the supply area of the camp to the front line, because especially the men who were firing cannons would get dehydrated to the point where they would just like fall out, and this would keep that from happening. Well, her husband ended up getting shot, so she just took his spot and started loading and firing the cannons. So that's pretty great. And then we have Deborah, for goodness sake, computer, come on. And then we had Deborah Sampson, who just dropped all pretense, disguised herself as a man, and fought as a soldier in the war. Just straight up fought in the war. She did end up getting injured at one point, and it was discovered that she was a woman, and due to the amount of help that she had been giving in the war, they're like, you know, despite, like, technically it's illegal that you're in the war because you're a woman, we're just going to give you an honorable discharge due to your injury. And later, even, like, after she died, years later, like, not due to her injury, her husband applied for, like, veteran benefits, because widows of veterans could apply for veteran benefits. That's just a thing. And her husband's like, my wife was a veteran. Doesn't it work the same way? And like, it took a little while because it technically had never happened before. But eventually, like, her husband and their children got like veteran family benefits due to her fighting in the Revolutionary War. That's pretty neat. Deborah Sampson was a hell of a character. Anyway, Valley's Forge sucked. I don't really have much to add to that. It's not that it was any worse than anywhere else in eastern Pennsylvania. It just wasn't very good. Here's the boys from Europe. I think this tall one here is Lafayette. He was known for being really tall and skinny. Here's Lydia Dara. There's the British generals just like chatting about state secrets. And it's like, oh, she's just a woman. She won't know any different. It's like, yeah, about that. Don't worry about it. There's Nancy Hart Morgan, knowing how to use a gun. And the British having second thoughts. in some of the stories, like her daughter helped too. Like her daughter also, because muskets are single shots. So her daughter also used a gun, which is why two of them went down before the neighbors came over. Margaret Corbin loading the cannon, getting ready to shoot some British. There's her husband bleeding out on the ground. Nah, he survived. And then Deborah Sampson. It was a heck of a time. So, one more thing for this section. Ooh. So on the home front, supplies were certainly scarce because a lot of it was going to the troops, even though supplies were still scarce for the troops. I mean, we didn't have any kind of real proper supply line. We're just like, well, I guess we're going to war. Oh, we're really not ready for this. And especially like when the war is where you're living, it's hard to maintain any kind of supply at all. Women working on the farms had to learn to work the fields on their own. A lot of families had to scavenge or loot to find what they needed to survive. And as we mentioned before, the greatest danger was when the city fell to one side or the other, because, as we've seen, women and children would face violence to the occupying soldiers regardless of who they were allied with. So, soldiers, especially after besieging a city, could be especially violent, and it didn't matter who they were enacting their violence on. Especially in coastal cities, women would band together and create local aid societies, trading with each other and just doing what they could to survive. Again, a bit like the frontier houses we've talked about already, where rather than buying things from a shop, people would just barter between each other and just like trade goods that they had for goods other people had and work together to survive. Though in this case, they'd also sort of have like a, what do we have? Yeah, I don't say anything about the eighth size. Oh. Okay. Anyway, there's New York getting burned down. Very vivid fire in this particular image. So, taking a step back from the actual battles and the soldiers, we have to look at what the governments of the colonies were doing. So, in 1777, the Articles of Confederation were drafted and sent to the states for approval. We'll talk about the Articles of Confederation in greater detail next chapter, because the next chapter is entirely on the Articles of Confederation and how they didn't really work, and we had to eventually make the Constitution. So this was a national government plan. 8 states ratified it by the middle of the next year, but it took 3 years before Maryland finally ratified it. We'll discuss why that is in just a little bit. And even before, like, the Declaration of Independence had been signed, a lot of states were already moving towards their own independent governments. They kicked out the royal officials, either using English common law or setting up their own constitutions, as we already saw with the Declaration of Independence. It just used language and things from constitutions that had already been created by other states. I mean, Virginia being kind of the main one. So a lot of them created relatively weak centralized powers. Pennsylvania, for example, increased the power of the voters and legislature, limited the executive branch. A lot of them included Virginia's Bill of Rights, freedom of the press, elections, trial by peers, formation of militias. Others included freedom of speech, bearing arms, equal protection by laws, etc. New Jersey was an interesting case. So New Jersey expanded voting rights to anyone who met certain property qualifications. Now, property qualifications for voting was common, but it was also like in addition to a bunch of other things, like being a man and being white and being of a certain education level. This was, if you had a certain amount of property, you could vote, which meant that single and widowed women, as well as free blacks that had a certain amount of property, could actually vote in local and state elections in New Jersey. It's hard to say if it was written that way with that in mind, or if it was just like a loophole. But basically, by omission, it allowed more voting than any other state in this, I wouldn't say newly formed union. It wasn't formed yet. This forming union of states. So, good on you, New Jersey. They changed that later, of course, but it's one of the first, or it's the first to do anything like that. So we have the Articles of Confederation, perpetual union between the states of all of that. I do like how they do it from north to south, rather than any kind of like any kind of order of when the states were created or alphabetical. It's like, no, we're just going to go from the top of the colonies down, which is that's fair. Well, some other issues going on besides the fact that we're fighting the most powerful empire in the world. Slavery, of course, because that's still a thing that exists, and we're fighting for our independence from Britain, yet we're still keeping people as bound slaves? Well, Vermont, from the start, 1777, they created their state constitution and abolished slavery because they're Vermont, and I mean, what do you need slaves in Vermont for? Pennsylvania created a gradual abolition model. Slaves born after 1780 would be freed once they reached the age of 28. So a lot of states actually followed this model of, well, I say a lot of states, a lot of northern states followed this model of, the slaves that are slaves right now, can't really do anything about, but slaves born after a certain year will only have to be slaves for a certain number of years, and then they can be freed, and after such amount of time, then basically it's abolished. So they're phasing it out, rather than just ending things entirely. For Vermont, it was like they had maybe, I don't know, 50 slaves in the whole state, if that, probably less. There was no big uproar in Vermont over we're abolishing slavery. It was like, I don't know, it'd be like saying we're abolishing I don't know, competitive ice fishing here in South Carolina. It's like not a thing that really existed. Who is texting me? Cool, I'll pick that up on the way out. Go away. All right. Massachusetts was an interesting case. Two slaves sued for freedom. Mumbet was actually the second one. She later renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman, which, hell of a last name there. She actually won her case first, and it created a legal precedent that made slavery incompatible with the state constitution, because unlike what we saw with that libel case a chapter or two ago, where it's like, oh, well, truth should protect you from libel. Cool, you won the case, but we're not changing the law. That was a thing that was essentially from the start with the United States, in that if a court case is won, it becomes the new precedent. And at least within Massachusetts, Elizabeth Freeman won the court case of being freed, and therefore slavery was now incompatible with the Constitution of Massachusetts, so now slavery is not allowed in Massachusetts. So that worked. Obviously, nobody south of Pennsylvania made any move to abolish slavery. I mean, we know what's coming. So, southern states own 400,000 of the 450,000 slaves in the nation. Again, they're not going to make any big moves. And in fact, things got worse for the slaves of the South because of the British, well, for one reason, the British offering freedom to any slaves that fought for them. So the southern slave owners did their best to prevent the slaves from getting away and joining the British. And the freed slaves that did escape to fight for the British often were left behind when the British would retreat from an area, and then would be recaptured by the southern troops and usually not brought back alive. Like, they were also not killed quickly, though. It was bad. That said, though, there were certain British commanders, Lord Dunmore in Virginia, General Sir Henry Clinton, who did manage to get a number of these freed slaves on the evacuation ships with them and carry them back to England or some other colony where they could be free, because I wouldn't say that England was like an emancipation nation at the time, but there was an emancipation movement beginning in England. And this is what, 1777? Within 30 years, Britain was going to end the transatlantic slave trade. So, like, we're getting there with England. They're a lot closer than the United States is. We're still 100 years out, and it takes a war. In England, it's just like an act of parliament. Still, though, there was a pretty decent blow to the institution of slavery over the course of the Revolution. Large free black communities in the North, especially in the seaport. Thousands of slaves gaining freedom in the South over the course of, the chaotic battles. All that said, though, the Continental Congress had other issues that they were focusing on besides slavery, because they were a bunch of rich white men, and most of them owned slaves. So they weren't really concerned too much about emancipation. And even the ones that weren't necessarily slave owners, like Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and, a lot of the big names, they recognized if they were going to have a unified region, they couldn't really push for emancipation, or they'd lose half of the colonies. So again, here we have the dates that the states abolished slavery. Again, by constitution, the furthest in the Northeast. This was part of Massachusetts at the time. So 1780, 77 in Vermont, 83 in New Hampshire. Gradual emancipation in these other states. This was considered the Northwest at the time. I know it's weird to think of today. This is something we'll get to later. And then, of course, the slave states down here. Bless you.
Thank you.
All right. Now, this next part is the important outcome from the Battle of Saratoga. And I kind of hate that the book put all this other stuff in between. I mean, not that it wasn't important, but kind of wish it had come right after Saratoga. So, France, very important. It was like the main thing on the minds of the Continental Congress. For one, France was a powerful military. Powerful military and a powerful, economy. Also, France had been fighting England since 1066, essentially, and it wouldn't be too hard to get them to fight England again. They just fought England in the 7 Years' War not that long ago. So being like, hey, you wanna beat up on England some more? Wouldn't be too bad. Wouldn't be too hard. Also, following the 7 Years' War, Britain was now the strongest power in Europe, and if the French could defeat Britain in a war, it would help to adjust the balance of power in Europe again. So that will be good for France. But as much as France and England love to go to war with each other, war was expensive, especially when you're the two biggest military powers in the world, and they just had that big war, that big 7 Years' War, and considering we talked about Britain's expenditure doubled over the course of the war, and they won, France probably was not in good shape. I know France wasn't in good shape. I talk about them in my European history class. They were not in good shape financially after that war either. So they weren't just going to idly jump into another one, especially if the people they were backing were going to get the crap kicked out of them by England anyway. Now, they were sending supplies to the colonies as early as 1775 because the French love sending military supplies to anybody that are messing with the British. The Irish have killed so many British with French guns. There's no way to keep count. Basically, any conflict that the British have had with anybody in the world, they've probably been supplied by French guns, at least before like World War I. Even then, the British almost sided with the Germans, but we'll get to that next semester. So after 1776, Continental Congress made Benjamin Franklin the ambassador to France because Benjamin Franklin was a very good diplomat, and B, the French loved the guy. He was very familiar with Parisian court politics and Paris in general, and again, the French just really liked him. He was a good guy to send over there. There's a polite way and a rude way to put this. He had a sense of humor that the Parisians appreciated. He was a little bit crude, but the Parisians were too, and they liked it. So, like, he was on their level. It's weird to think about Benjamin Franklin having, like, a dirty sense of humor, but he did. And the French liked that. But it was, again, the Battle of Saratoga that made it so that the French were even willing to talk about an alliance because, again, they needed to make sure they weren't just jumping in to a war that the ones they were helping were going to immediately get their butts kicked and the French were going to be left on their own. You know, kind of like what we did with Vietnam. So with the French officially talking about an alliance with the Americans, British declared war on the French and eventually Spain, because Spain was also allied with France. And Spain didn't jump in right away. It took like a year before Spain officially joined in, but they were there too. Spain was so much weaker than France. It's sad because they used to be, well, I mean, we talked about it earlier this semester. They used to be like one of the major power players in the world. And after the Spanish Armada, they just were not. But anyway, France and Spain were now fighting the British, and this moved the war into a global conflict. They were now fighting in Gibraltar, West Africa, and the West Indies, which of course meant that the British were spending a lot more money on this war than they were before. In 1775, it was a £4 million sterling war, and by 1782, it was 20 million pounds sterling. So, the French were costing the British a lot of money, which, I mean, now the British are costing themselves a lot of money with their weird political decisions. So the French sent officers, weapons, funds, and a navy over here, because we didn't have any kind of navy. They didn't send, like, regiments of troops, but they sent the thing we were lacking, which is to say, like, proper military officers. We had, like, 5 of them. Weapons, which we could always use more of. Money, which we could definitely use more of. In fact, that's going to be, like, I think the entire next slide. Yeah, the entire next slide is we had no money. Meanwhile, Spain used New Orleans as a port for privateers, which is to say pirates being paid by Spain, and used Florida as a base from which to send out expeditionary forces to just harass the British. So Spain was there too. They were just annoying the hell out of the British. The Spanish are a little bit more important in a later battle we'll talk about, but I don't know. They were there. I shouldn't be so rude to the Spanish. They were definitely there. Anyway, Lord North, he's the new Prime Minister of Britain. He pulled all the British forces back to New York as a last stronghold, which, as I said, they remain in through the remainder of the war. So the British are no longer like spread throughout the colonies. There are a few more battles, but it's no longer like the British are everywhere now. Now, also on this slide, I have what I consider one of the greatest images for this section of history, if not this entire semester. That should hopefully help you remember this slide at least. This is anytime somebody's fighting the British and asks the French for help. Because I saw this, I'm like, oh, this has got to go in a PowerPoint. Now again, technically after the Battle of Saratoga, but also like, hey, we're fighting for our independence. Cool. It's against the British. Oh, it's against the British. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, Lafayette was over here like from the start. It's like, oh, you're fighting the British, are you? I might can help with that. I mean, I feel like just from the start we're annoyed at the British, and he just sort of like appears in the room. Anyway, we didn't have crap for money. Also, though, there was an unintended problem with the French helping us out. Less people were volunteering for the military because it's like, oh, we've got the French helping us out, and the French are really strong, and they're basically on par with England. So we don't really need to volunteer as much now. So we were actually getting less people joining in. Also, with men being captured in battle and being made prisoner, reports were coming out of New York, and prisoner ships, 8,000 to 11,000 prisoners were dying in prison, were dying in military prisons, which were more than were dying fighting the British, because these military prisons were awful. I mean, prisons in general in 1700 were awful because sanitation didn't really exist. The prison ships were even worse because, as I've mentioned before, it was awful to be on a ship, but when they just parked a ship out right off the coast and just like stuck a bunch of people in it, you just got sick immediately. Yeah, so people were just like dying in prison if you got captured. I mean, I'd just about rather get shot than just like, oh, we're hauling you off to prison where you're just going to slowly die of whatever disease you get. It's like, oh, this sucks. Why even surrender? Meanwhile, the Continental Congress, as we've mentioned, couldn't raise funds because it couldn't tax the colonies. Had to take loans from France, the Netherlands, and also wealthy patriots. So people who were like, well, we've got money, so we'll loan money to the government. You know, there's that actually becomes government bonds later. Those are actually loans to the government where you buy bonds and you can redeem them later. The colonies attempted to print paper money, known as continentals. However, especially at the time, continentals weren't really backed by any solid currency, so they very quickly depreciated in value. And that 100 continentals were required to buy a single silver dollar by 1780. Now, again, I'm not an economist. I don't really understand the ins and outs of this concept we call money because it's a thing we make up. But when you have a paper banknote, it's the fiat currency. It's a promise that this is worth some money somewhere in a bank vault. Whereas a silver dollar is worth the silver that coin's made of. It's, silver dollar is a big ass silver coin. And that value isn't really going to change unless the value of silver itself changes. But a piece of paper money, you would think would be the same way because it's worth whatever the gold that's backing it, but it's more complicated. It's weird. And also, people really didn't trust paper money. I did a whole thing when I was in grad school working with someone who was doing a book on like the economy following World War, the Revolutionary War, and people hated paper money, called it like the devil's money and all these other weird pejoratives. So yeah, Continentals were not well liked. There were riots in Philadelphia over high prices and low wages. Militiamen joined the protests, marching on the house of James Wilson, who had sided with the merchants. Eventually, 15 militiamen were arrested, but they did later distribute food because, well, people weren't able to eat. And we've got riots in the middle of a war. So that's not great. Not a good time to have a riot. Eventually, we did get things somewhat leveled out by taking a $6 million loan from France to back these certificates that we were giving the Patriots. States began making their own taxes to back the paper money that they were distributing because, again, the states need to have some kind of depository of money to back the paper money that they're printing. Otherwise, the paper money's worth the paper that it's printed on. However, if you recall, the whole revolution thing was because people were getting tired of the taxes that the British were putting on them, but now we're having each state do their own taxes in order to back the paper money that they're printing, and people are immediately getting annoyed about that. It's weird when you want to create your own government that you don't want taxes, but you quickly realize in order to run a government you need taxes. Weird how that works. We're actually going to see some. We're going to see some interesting experiments with that after the test. Some embargoes and tariffs and stuff. Anyway, here's a $20 Continental, a Philadelphia $20 Continental specifically. Oh yeah, each state had its own type of currency, so if you went between states, you had to basically exchange it, and each state had a different exchange rate. So, that was normal. Oh, I love this picture. So here's, I'm guessing this was supposed to be the Philadelphia riots. This was the only picture I could really find on it. There is so much happening here. Dude here's getting just straight up impaled. This guy, pulled a lamppost out of the ground. There's some weird goblin man here, pickpocketing the guy that's shanking the other guy. There's two people, coming out a window over here. Who knows what this is? What would you be dumping out of a window in the middle of the night? What? Yeah, chamber pot. Because you didn't have plumbing back then. So they're getting some not so good stuff dumped on their heads. I'd almost rather be getting stabbed. Those chamber pots were ripe. All right, let's see. Let's go a little bit further because I think we might actually be able to review on Monday if I can get a little further along. All right. So Congress wanted to settle land claims in the West, which I'll get into that in just a moment because there were some weird land claims. And also build relations with the natives. But it's weird to, well, I say weird. It's very difficult to settle claims made by the colonists and also make friends with the people who you're taking land from. And Patriot leaders made it very clear that if they managed to win their independence from Britain, they would immediately begin moving west. So in the South, Patriots and Cherokees fought each other due in part to the attacks by according to the book, a rogue Cherokee warrior named Dragon Canoe. I don't know how rogue he was because I imagine the Cherokee didn't appreciate us moving into their land. Nancy Ward, or Nanyi He, was his sister, who was sympathetic to the Patriot cause, so that was some inter-family drama there. There was a lot of Western land that had been claimed by the states, and as was common in Europe especially, the idea was once the war was over, this land will be largely given to the soldiers to reward them for their contribution during the war. Maryland, however, had no claims because, as I'm going to show you with the map, for the most part, it was like whatever the states bordered, they just continued west, like Georgia just continued west into what will become Alabama, and North Carolina just continued west into what will become Tennessee, etc. Then the states got weird as they went further north. I'll get to that. Maryland, though, is on the coast. They're not bordering anything, so they didn't have any claims. And they're like, well, we're not going to sign the Articles of Confederation until you make all these lands common property, which is to say federal land that the Continental Congress would basically make into new states. It would be parceled out into free and independent governments. So rather than it be extensions of existing states, it will be made into new independent states. So by 1780, New York ceded its claims. Connecticut, Massachusetts ceded theirs. This is why it took so long for Maryland to actually ratify the Articles of Confederation because, again, this whole land claim issue. But the idea of using the Western lands for the common benefit of the United States clearly meant that it would not be used for the benefit of the people who were already living there, the Native Americans. So this was going to ensure conflict for the foreseeable future. And boy, we will jump right into that, especially next semester. So let me just pull this map up because it's starting from the south. It seems normal and then it gets not normal. So Spain actually gave us this. it was part of Florida, and they just gave that to us. So that was nice. Um, this was given to Georgia, or this was claimed by Georgia and then given to the U.S. government. This was South Carolina's claim, and then we gave that to Georgia because it's like, we don't really want this little ass strip of land. We just give that to Georgia. This one makes the most sense because it's just a regular ass extension of the borders that were already there. I mean, and you can already just see in your mind's eye, this is just Tennessee. There used to be a state of Franklin. Look at that. That's weird. And then it starts getting weird. This one again kind of makes sense. It follows the river, becomes Kentucky. But then you get all this weird stuff. So you've got this green line that becomes what New York is claiming, but New York's way the hell up here. Everything in red is what Virginia claimed, but Virginia's way down here. There's no West Virginia yet. Everything over here is claimed by Connecticut, but Connecticut's over here. Massachusetts, but they're over here. Also, this is technically part of Massachusetts at the time. Like, what even the hell, guys? No wonder Maryland's like, we don't, what is any of this? I mean, Delaware didn't have anything either, but they were just not even trying to get in the middle of this mess. So yeah, it was weird. Like I said, starting from the bottom, it kind of makes sense, and then you start getting into these weird lines. It's just like, what is all of this? The only thing I could find on Dragon Canoe and Nancy Ward was this weird children's book. Nancy Ward, her cry was all for peace. Dragon Canoe, we are not yet conquered. I don't know. All right, let's do one more, and then we should be able to knock out the rest of it on Monday and do the study guide. So, I'm going to reduce as much of what we need to do on Monday so we don't run over time. So there were still battles in the Ohio-Mississippi River valleys. The British had their native allies attacking the Spanish troops and American settlers. We didn't really have a proper general out there. As I told my class yesterday, we didn't really have a George Washington to back us up there. We had George Rogers Clark. He was a Virginia surveyor, and he just did his best, and his best was pretty darn good. Counter-native raids, reinforced French and Spanish allies, and led a surprise attack in February at Vincennes, and basically took a fort from the British, which strengthened the hold of the French and Americans in the region. The British kept hold of Detroit, but the Spanish defeated a large attack from the British and native allies hitting St. Louis, so the Americans managed to hold on to the Ohio River Valley. Meanwhile, we have General John Sullivan, so we did have an American general in the area. He was mostly just murdering natives. Went around, burned Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Oneida villages. Lots of hatred attacks against women and children. Massacre of 100 Delaware men, women, and children, despite the tribe having converted to Christianity and declaring themselves neutral. So even with the end of the Revolution, the conflict between the natives and the American settlers would not end. Again, we're going to talk about it well into next semester. But for the moment, the Americans and their French and Spanish allies have mostly control over the Ohio Mississippi River valleys, which are very important for, well, maintaining control of that entire region, because the rivers are extremely important for moving supplies and especially troops from like the Great Lakes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So here's George Rogers Clark doing a hell of a job for a surveyor. And here's the attack on St. Louis. And, I mean, if you've got cannons in a tower, I think you're in pretty good shape. Oh, yeah, and there's Major General John Sullivan, known for massacring Native families. And here he is, murdering Native families. You know, just like murdering babies. All right, we will finish this up on Monday. I'll see you guys then. Have a good weekend.